Our next guest travels the globe, engaging diverse groups of Muslims around the world on what they think about democracy, women's rights and radical Islamists. She's the co-author of a new survey, Who Speaks for Islam? What a Billion Muslims Really Think. Here to discuss some of the findings is Dalia Moggerhead. Welcome to the program.
Thank you. It's wonderful to be here.
So what are the most important issues on the minds of Muslims as you lay out in your book?
Well, we find out that the most important issues are those that are the most important on the minds of people around the world. Just basic needs, getting a better job, having a better education for children's families. But when it comes to their views of the West, things are actually much more complicated than we often see in the mainstream media.
In what sense?
Well, for one thing, Muslims don't view the West as monolithic. So they view the United States very differently than they view, say, countries like France and Germany. Their views of the West are quite nuanced. So, for example, Egyptians are as positive about other Muslims in Pakistan as they are about Christian French people, but tend to be much more negative about the United States and Britain. So what we find is that it's not culture or religion that drives people's sentiment, but rather their perception of countries' policies.
Okay, I want to get into what you found in a bit more detail, but talk briefly about the poll's methodology. I mean, how do you speak for a billion Muslims?
It's quite an audacious claim to make. We went into more than 35 majority Muslim countries, as well as countries with significant Muslim minorities, and did representative interviews. We talked to 1,000 people in each country. Now, it's very important. It's not the number of people, but how they were selected. They were selected according to a random stratified sample, meaning they actually represent the country as a whole. Now, if we take the sum of all of the populations of the countries that we looked at, we actually find that we talked to a representative sample of a billion Muslims.
Mm-hmm. And why did you feel that it was important to go directly to the people, to sort of bypass policymakers and pundits and leaders? Why did you choose to leave that group of people out?
Dalia, since 9/11 and even before, what has happened is that a vocal fringe has really monopolized the conversation about the West and the Muslim world. And what we wanted to do is what Gallup has been doing for 70 years, which is helping ordinary people be heard. And we use survey research to get that done. And we did the same thing here for the globe. Actually, my study is just a smaller part of a much wider global study. It was important that ordinary people who don't have access to the media, who are being silenced by so many factors, finally get a voice and get heard as to the really important issues here.
Well, let's look at this key figure of 7%, the segment that the poll describes as politically radicalized. What's their profile, and what do you mean by radicalized?
Well, first I'll start with how we define the 7%. What we did is looked at the responses to a question we asked about the justifiability of 9/11. And we found that those who said that 9/11 was completely justified, answered a 5 on a 5-point scale, were distinctly different in many ways from those who answered a 1 through 4 on that question. So we looked at these outliers, these 5s, and then also looked at their opinions of the United States. So the way we found the 7% is that 7% globally have an unfavorable opinion of the United States and thought 9/11 was completely justified. And we compared them to the mainstream.
Right, and this 7%, are they hardened terrorists who want to kill Americans?
No, not necessarily. We would call them more like the terrorist cheering section. What they are people who sympathize with terrorism, but the vast majority would likely never actually take any action. But this is the support, the moral support for the terrorist movement. And so it's very important to understand what is driving this opinion. And so we looked at that 7% and we called them the politically radicalized, and found surprisingly to many people that they were no more religious than the mainstream. So it wasn't religious fervor that was driving this sympathy for terrorism. We also found that they were on average more affluent and more educated than the mainstream.
So in a sense, these findings kind of fly in the face of conventional wisdom. I mean,
absolutely.
How have we got it so wrong, if I can be as bold to ask you, because this book is saying a lot of stuff that is contrary to what most Americans think and know about Islam.
Well, the source of conventional wisdom is, in many cases, the media. And what has monopolized the public sphere thus far are vocal extremists. And until now, we haven't had a good, clear, and scientific look at ordinary people. And so we really talk about this idea of the silenced majority who have been silenced by vocal extremists. And when our perceptions are driven by an extremist fringe rather than the mainstream, they tend to be inaccurate.
So what you're saying is that it's not religion that's motivating these radicals, these Islamists, that it's politics.
Yes, exactly. What makes
and specifically foreign policy?
In many cases, yes. What really makes them different from the mainstream is their level of anger and perception of being threatened and controlled by the United States. They are also more likely to believe that they have less freedom than they wish to have in their own countries. So it's really a lack of satisfaction with the status quo domestically, as well as a sense of being threatened and controlled by the U.S.
And where are these attitudes hardening, do you think? And also talk about where opinions were most positive.
Well, the place that the opinions were the most positive was in sub-Saharan Africa, among Muslims. So it's a very interesting study because it was so global. We found that the most positive opinions of the U.S. in the world were among Muslims, and the most negative were also held by Muslims. So the most positive were in places like Sierra Leone, where 87% of the population said they had favorable opinions of the U.S. government. In contrast, we found that in France, and that's among the general population, Germany, and in Saudi Arabia, that's where there was the most negative opinion of the U.S. government.
And was it in single digits or?
Single digits, absolutely, or maybe double digits in the low teens. But the idea being that not all Muslims hate America, and not all those that disapprove of the U.S. government are Muslim.
Well, why do you think that debates about Islam have blurred the distinction between terrorists and what the rest of the Muslim world thinks?
Well, I think there are several reasons for that. The first one is that, of course, the terrorists are saying in their rhetoric that they're doing things in the name of religion. So they're lacing their rhetoric with religious imagery. Now, they do that because, as we found in our research, something like 98% of the population say religion is an important part of their daily life. And so the terrorists are simply using the language that resonates, that has a chance of resonating with the population.
But what about using rhetoric from Quranic verses to justify their attacks against Americans? Are you saying that that is simply not the case in terms of any of the 50-odd thousand people that you surveyed?
Actually, that's exactly what I'm saying. What was so interesting is that we asked a follow-up question after finding out what people thought of 9/11. And in some select countries, we didn't ask this question everywhere, but when we asked this follow-up question and asked people why they said what they did about 9/11, we found something very interesting. The mainstream, who did not fall in the 7%, they talked about religion. They talked about how God hates the killing of civilians. They also talked about their moral, simply just their regular human moral objection to terrorism. On the other hand, the 7% who said it was completely justified, not a single one of them used Quranic verses to justify their position. They talked in terms of their socio-political perceptions.
And what do you think that Americans can do to help change their image in the Muslim world? What's your first sort of top thing that could be done to sort of change perceptions?
Well, there are a number of things. I think the most important one is to start by diagnosing the problem accurately, and we do that by listening directly to ordinary people.
All right, Dalia Moghahed, thank you very much for coming on the program.
Thank you. It was wonderful to be here.